The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
There was a time when mixing faith and politics was taboo. But that has slowly changed over the last 30 years. Today we discuss religion and politics with Ray Suarez, senior correspondent for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer and author of The Holy Vote, The Politics of Faith in America. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Ray Suarez, welcome back to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Great to be here.
On our first program, we discussed the future of journalism, settled all sorts of problems, and we talked about your role as a journalist. Now I'd like to talk about this wonderful book you wrote, The Holy Vote, The Politics of Faith in America. You sound a little angry in this book.
I am a total, down to my marrow, small d Democrat. If the people hash it out and agree on it, that's good enough for me. But we've really changed the way we do politics and really changed the way religion operates in the political sphere without talking about it.
What do you mean by we've changed the way we do politics?
Religion has influenced people's political sentiments for as long as there's been a United States. So taking politics and religion and trying to create some artificial separation is impossible. But we have changed the techniques, the technology, the body language, the cultural cues, and now we have in the State of the Union address bits and snatches of Christian scripture, old congregational hymns, and winks and nods to various parts of the American whole on the part of politicians that I think is different. It is different.
And now, I know we're a much more religious or at least observant society than other nations. I pulled out some numbers before coming here. We are 8 times, as a nation, 8 times more likely to say that God is very important in our lives compared to the French or Germans. I was quite strict. 58% of Americans say God is very important in their lives. Only 8% of Germans are French. 60% of the French never go to church, compared to only 15% of Americans, quote, never go to church, and I think that includes synagogues and,
right.
And so forth. So is this a rebirth of religion in this country?
There's 2 separate things that we have to look at. Religious Americans and institutional churches, and churches' relationships with political parties. And those are 2 different things. Everybody thinks about religion in a slightly different way. It affects individual consciences in a slightly different way. And that's for you, and that belongs to you, and that's something in the quiet time, if there is any in your life at the end of the day, that really you can mull over. But when a serving general in the United States Army goes in uniform to churches and says that we're fighting a war against the devil in the Middle East, that's a problem. When a candidate for president talks about a faith-based initiative and goes to a church and holds up a Bible and says, this is the handbook for the faith-based initiative, that's a problem. Only to those Americans, the tens of millions of them, who say, you know, we may all disagree on where the line is, but when it's crossed, we understand it. It's like the old Supreme Court decision on pornography.
Potter Stewart.
Potter Stewart. Well, he knows it when he sees it. People No, when they get that feeling like, and these are people who are even co-religionists to the general, to the presidential candidate, they think, yeah, I even agree with him, but I'm not sure I like that in the campaign.
Well, let's go. I want to go back because I want to define what you just said and look at each piece separately. First, you implied that there has been some increase in, let's call it, religiosity. And this is true worldwide, right? We call it evangelical or fundamentalist, whether it's fundamentalist Muslims, whether it's Pentecostals, which is, I think, the fastest growing church in Latin America, and evangelicals in this country, and Jewish fundamentalism. There's some kind of religious revival around the world, isn't there?
At the margins. Those groups are all more present, more visible, but they are still small parts of the whole. But they have an impact. If you don't take sugar in your coffee, if somebody puts in even a pinch, you can taste it.
So here comes the politics. So what you want to tell me, what you want to say, right? Because I've read the Holy Vote. So what you want to tell us is that what's changed is organized religion, at least organized Christian religion, is now playing a larger role in electoral politics. When did that start?
There's been swipes at it throughout our history, but it's the convergence of the larger numbers, the larger power and voice of the more conservative churches, and the technology, all converging in a short span of years. We're redrawing the congressional map of the United States. Power is draining away from the Great Lakes in the Northeast, the old population centers.
More secular centers.
And more secular because they're more diverse. So politics had to be more secular. And there are now more and more members in the South and the West. And more people in the South and the West. So the population axis changes, the cultural axis changes. Jimmy Carter runs for president in 1976, and Americans in their masses hear for the first time in a long time a major party candidate speaking about faith in a way that was really unusual.
And he helps mobilize, or maybe that's the wrong word, but the evangelicals in the South. He carries
Absolutely.
the South. He, the Democrat, right, enjoys the more religiously oriented vote.
And in their view, Jimmy Carter lets them down.
Well, you could say he brought them to the altar, not to be too cute about this, and then ran off.
Right. They
with the
felt
secularists.
By the end of his term that they had made a bad bet with Jimmy Carter. But his effect, his galvanizing effect, was still important, because there they were, lined up in the arena.
Ready to be picked.
Ready to be picked by Ronald Reagan.
How did he do that?
After the rotten structures of Jim Crow are pulled down, the South completely reorganizes. And those segregation academies to which white families fled after Brown now have their next iteration. As people move to subdivisions and tract housing and move to a new South, they want tax status, they want deductibility for those schools, but also, this is in the wake of Roe v. Wade. This is in the wake of the real wrenching changes of the 60s. This is at a time when they are starting to feel their oats and also defining themselves counterculturally against what they see as the new consensus of the media, of politics, of what they see on television, a coarsening culture, a sexualizing culture. And the church, a different kind of church too, by the way, no longer a family Baptist church in a town or a county seat with 200 members or 250 members, but now a bigger
megachurch.
Yes. Now a church with thousands of members, which is rising out of formerly agricultural land at the edge of the subdivision, now increasingly non-denominational, And Ronald Reagan comes along as the Jell-O is starting to set in the fridge.
So what does he do? How does he send the signal, I'm with you?
He identifies evangelical leaders early, goes, visits their churches, has his picture taken with them, goes to the National Association of Religious Broadcasters in a now famous speech in 1980 and says, I know you can't endorse me, but I can endorse you. Thunderous applause, standing ovation, and really, in real life, that distinction he was making kind of gets rubbed away anyway.
Well,
they go on to endorse him in all but name.
I know you talk a little bit about that in the book. I find, for myself, I find that an interesting problem because the African American church, has been there for the Democrats in many ways, large and small, over the years, and I think it's part of politics. It's just an inevitable part of politics. So Reagan does this. He takes hold of them. How about George Herbert Walker Bush?
Not their kind of guy. Bush said the right things through his time as vice president and president. He came politically from Texas, even though his birth certificate may say Connecticut or Massachusetts. And through it all, he was never able to convince social conservatives in the South and the West that he was their kind of guy. They gave him their support, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes holding their nose. He did carry those states in 1988, but he never was able to completely close the sale. He was asked famously by a reporter whether he was born again, which is common currency in these circles to describe your own born again experience and when you made an adult profession of faith as a Christian. And he went into deep George Herbert Walker Bush mode, circumlocuitous, tortured. I felt for the guy. As an Episcopalian, listening to my co-religionist talk about a thing that we just don't talk about.
Yeah,
I felt for you, George. I mean, I knew exactly what was going through his mind. He wanted to present an answer that both he could feel like he was telling the truth and leave them walking away satisfied at the end of the encounter, and it wasn't going to happen.
We should explain. So I think it's John 3:13, yea, though a man be born again, he can't see the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
And being born again is?
Well, it's left undefined in the Gospels. And through 2,000 years of Christian history, it's meant all kinds of things. Quite literally, having a vision, having a change of heart or a change of conscience that reorients your life. Some people have described it in visceral, physical terms, where they can feel something happening to them, more akin to the transfiguration of Jesus that's talked about in the New Testament. So what it means to be born again is open to, I think, a lot of discussion. And if you ask Christians about it, they may tell you 600 different stories and all think that they mean the same thing as everybody else who's telling it. But George Bush was not having a good day when he was trying to explain his own high church born-again experience.
Now his son, George W. Bush, at least by the official story, did have a transforming experience that commingled religion, drinking, and responsible behavior, right?
Yes, and he has told his faith story at men's groups and church gatherings, and it's been injected into America's political bloodstream in a way that, I mean, I don't think you've heard Dwight Eisenhower talk about his faith experience, or Lyndon Johnson, or Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, incidentally, a very religious man, very observant, faithful Sunday worshiper, someone who talked a lot with clerics through his life as a public servant about how those two inform each other, but had no public identity as a Christian. When I ask crowds, when I was lecturing about the Holy Vote, to what church did Dwight Eisenhower belong? You get blank stares. To what church did Lyndon Johnson belong? A man who really unleashed a social revolution in the United States through his work to pass the civil rights laws. We've come to a new place where we now know that George Bush left the Episcopal Church of his upbringing, became a Methodist. Laura is a Methodist. Jeb Bush, a convert, an adult convert to Catholicism. Both leaving the churches of their family home, but also entering churches that put them in the slipstream of the politics of their adopted states. Now, a cynic would say, oh, hey, do you feel comfortable saying that? It's just an observation. I'm not suggesting it was calculation. I'm not suggesting it was some ugly thing that they did. But what it did also was made them more like the people they wanted to win over, run amongst, be amongst. You know, Episcopalians are now 0.8% of the population of the United States.
And they're not even happy with their leadership.
And there's a lot of family feuds inside that group as well.
Well, if George W. Bush got it, this religion thing, as his father would say, John Kerry didn't.
John Kerry, a bit older, though not much older, but older in his affect than George W. Bush, from a different part of the country, where you could be a next-door neighbor with someone, know them for years, and not know where or whether they go to church. New England consensus culture is just different. You can be visiting in the South, as I have been, for 10 or 15 minutes, and someone will be introduced to you and shake your hand and ask you where you go to church. I was quite taken aback the first time it happened. Right? I was in Huntsville, Alabama, and somebody asked me where I go to church, and I thought, do I know you? Then I told him, and he didn't seem very satisfied by the answer. But John Kerry came from a different world where you don't talk about those things. And he had a real personal, but also, I think, cultural difficulty in going on national television or talking to a reporter from the Atlantic or the New Yorker or Time magazine about how often he went to Mass and what he thought happened there and why it was important to him.
And he did go to Mass.
And he did go to Mass, yeah.
But he got himself photographed carrying a gun, going hunting or whatever.
In Ohio. Yeah. But didn't help enough, apparently.
But never got himself photographed coming out of church, I think.
A couple of things happened. There was push polling suggesting that Kerry was a bad Catholic. So they would call Catholics and say, did you know that John Kerry believes this and this and this? And at the same time, bishops from a couple of small dioceses around the country publicly announced that they would refuse John Kerry the sacraments if he came to their church. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, while it was very unlikely that he would go to Mass in some of the places these bishops were pastoring, it had its effect. It opened a whole conversation in the national Roman Catholic Church, the largest religious body in the United States. 1 out of every 4 Americans is a Roman Catholic. It opened a huge debate inside that church about the public role of Catholic politicians, what we expect them to do, what they are expected to do as legislators. And it was a fascinating contrast with 1960, when, in order to buttress his plausibility, Roman Catholic John F. Kennedy goes to the country and says, the bishops don't tell me how to legislate. I don't take orders from Rome. Yes, I am a Catholic, and I will be a good president and a good Catholic, but they're two different things. Fast forward 44 years, and there's John Kerry trying to defend himself as a Catholic against his own co-religionists who are finding him not Catholic enough and not willing to say publicly that his Catholic faith, yes, is going to affect the way he governs, is going to affect the way he legislates.
So we've talked about a resurgence of religion in terms of politics and religion. We've talked about the institutional or the political side of what's happening. I'd like to add one third piece in the time we have, and that is it sometimes seems to me that we're in the middle also of a culture war with the more evangelical groups just angry about where they think society is going, whether it's out-of-wedlock births or gay marriage or drug use or whatever. And I'm struck by the rhetoric at the end of the 2004 campaign in Ohio. I went and did a Google search, and the phrase, vote your pocketbook, comes up a lot, with Al Sharpton saying to the African-American community, you should vote your pocketbook, and then he would sort of mumble, not your values. That's a sort of losing argument, isn't it?
It is a losing argument, and that was a last-minute riposte or counterattack to the very effective organization of black churches that had been done by the Republican Party in 2004. They understood, as any student of American politics understands, that black Americans, especially church-going black Americans, are among the most socially conservative Americans. And yet they still do want an activist government because they see government as able to solve the problems of common people in a way that their class but not racial peers on the other side of the racial divide do no longer see government in that way. Mm-hmm. So leaders of large church organizations in the black church have this bifurcated person that they're talking to. Someone who still does want government involved in their lives and yet sees an almost libertinism in government circles as injurious to the social fabric. So they don't want gay marriage. They want to discourage abortion. They don't want birth control being discussed in public schools, even though the teenage pregnancy rate in a lot of inner city schools that are heavily attended by black pupils is very high and very threatening. So they are trying to do a very subtle thing, and it was the Republicans who captured their attention in 2004.
Is this religious vote up for grabs? Does it disappear?
Well, the president's approval rating has gone down to about 33, 34%. But a significant, like 3/4 of that 34% is Christian conservatives.
Is that right?
So they're sticking. They're sticking the whole way till January 2009. I doubt there's going to be some big Democratic resurgence among those voters who are still with the president in this 6th year of his presidency. What is more threatening to the Republicans is that they just go home. They go back to where they were on the sidelines before 1976. A big threat to the Republicans in the coming election, and one thing that makes it an uphill battle for them, is that the public disaffection with the second Bush term has severed any possible connection that a candidate might want to make between faithfulness and competence in office. George Bush is, by common consent, one of the most publicly faithful presidents in the modern era. And in the 6th year of his presidency, he's got the lowest approval rating of a president at a similar time in his presidency. So a candidate who wants to run a Bush-style candidacy in the coming couple of cycles, these things don't last forever, they're just tendencies, cannot be that publicly faithful a la Bush and think of it as a winning strategy because the public will think, therefore he has a better shot at being a good president, because that has been smashed.
It truly has. Of course, there isn't a leading Republican who could lay claim to that vote either.
Right.
Rudy Giuliani, McCain.
McCain has run as a secular politician. In part, he's an Arizonan. Yes, he's a national politician. But people forget that the Rocky Mountain West has not been a hotbed of that kind of religious politics. Barry Goldwater had a really unusual faith biography.
Yes.
And was not one of those kinds of politicians. They've tended to be more libertarian. They're conservatives of the leave me alone stripe, not the don't let them do that stripe. And John McCain has very appropriately reflected that part of the country. But now he has to run in South Carolina and Tennessee and Alabama, and it's not going to be that easy for him.
It surely isn't. This has been a great interview. Ray Suarez, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
And for our audience, if you have questions or comments to us, it's policywatch@UMD for University of Maryland.edu. Thank you very much.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.